We are back. Another edition of the Gold Standard. I'm Joe Danneman. He is Charlie Goldsmith. We talk Reds and Bengals on this podcast. As of this taping, it is Reds Fest weekend with some of the biggest name Cincinnati Reds currently and of past in town. We'll talk a lot about the Reds in this podcast, but let's start with the Bengals. Major shakeup in the AFC North. Only one team is bringing its coach back, and it's the Cincinnati Bengals, Zach Taylor. What's your biggest takeaway from Mike Tomlin leaving Pittsburgh, John Harbaugh leaving Baltimore, and Kevin Stefanski leaving Cleveland, looking through a prism of a Cincinnati Bengals fan?
The biggest takeaway was not that we needed it, but just a reminder of how much of a missed opportunity there was in 2025, how vulnerable these teams clearly were. Sure, they have they're unbelievable head coaches. But how I viewed the Ravens and Steelers was as two teams who independently could have fired each their offensive and defensive coordinator at the end of this season. That's where these teams were at. And that's why I felt like they each needed a major shakeup. You can make the case for the Bengals that, all right, of course, if Zach was just an offensive coordinator, this wouldn't have been a fire the offensive coordinator season. Of course not. And then their defense, we got plenty of time to talk, but they just made that change. So the Bengals, you could see why they had more faith in the people running each unit individually, offense and defense. So when you take the head coachingness of it out of it, it does make more sense to me why the Bengals didn't make a change versus why those other teams did.
Taking a 20,000-foot view of the rosters and just the makeup of the organization, would it be a reasonable argument to say right now in early January that the Bengals are in the best position of any of the teams in the AFC North? Because you look across the AFC North, yes, Baltimore has their quarterback, but they don't have their coach. Pittsburgh doesn't have a quarterback or a coach. Cleveland doesn't have a quarterback or a coach. The Bengals have both of those. Now, you can argue what Zach Taylor is as a head coach, but just looking organizationally, is it a fair argument to make that the Bengals are in the best position leading into the 2026 offseason?
I think it depends on who the Ravens hire as their head coach. If the Ravens, to me, hire Robert Saleh or Brian Flores, look what Saleh did last week with you and me playing, linebacker. I mean, the 49ers defense is decimated, and he's got a track record of being and of course, Baltimore has some very good pieces, some holes on that defense as well, but some elite pieces that, to me, if they hired Saleh or if they hire Brian Flores and with it his unbelievable blitzing scheme, which can turn just about any defense into a top 10 unit, you pair that defense, either one of them, with Lamar Jackson, and that to me sets up the Ravens for the most success. But if you hire a defensive coach who isn't as scheme specific, or even an offensive coach, even if that might be the right move, that leaves you more vulnerable on defense, to me that would shift it to the Bengals. So to me it depends on who the Ravens hire.
Last time we talked, it was the day before the big Duke Tobin press conference. He spoke for more than an hour, took nearly 50 questions. My two big takeaways were there's not going to be a lot of change or any inside the Bengals front office when it comes to evaluating talent. And B, yes, he knows the defense has to be fixed. He talks so much about pass rush. He talks so much about situational football as being the two areas where the Bengals have to get better immediately. We could argue that the Bengals have to be more aggressive in free agency. I think everybody watching this or listening to this would say, yes, of course, the Bengals have to go after free agents and maybe try to replicate what they did in 2021 to a lesser extent considering the contracts they currently have here in Cincinnati. You're looking at free agents, okay? Give us a general feel before we get into any kind of a mock draft season. What's the general strength of the current 2026 free agent class in the NFL that the Bengals can take advantage of?
I think the strength is what you would call the tier of next Trey Hendricksons. I guess the only current Trey Hendrickson, Pro Bowl pass rusher on the market is Trey Hendrickson. I don't expect him to come back. But when you remember what Trey was, clearly a player on the rise in 2021 with a flawed resume, when you look at, I'll go through his 2021 resume now, a flawed resume with some specific things that indicated a high ceiling. I see 5 or 6 guys like that who will be available in the $12 to $18 million range. I think when I start with the Bengals offseason, it will be by Personally, I would start with a guy like that. Now, you can make an even stronger case where you look at some of the most dangerous defenses in the league. What that starts with is a pass rushing defensive tackle. And I've heard people in the Bengals building make a case that gives you more headaches than an edge rusher. The problem is, by far one of the weakest classes I've seen at any position is the current defensive tackle pass rush class in free agency. So weak that it changes how I view the idea of bringing back BJ Hill as opposed to making him a cap casualty. And then there's the most depth in your veteran linebacker class, guys who can start, give some support in that room to Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight.
So what you're saying is if there's only a handful of guys that are available that are going to be difference makers at edge rusher and defensive tackle that can pressure the quarterback, the Bengals are going to have to pay a lot of money to get these guys to want to come to Cincinnati. Now, maybe the fact that one of the best offenses in the NFL, Joe Burrow's here, the guys see an opportunity to win in Cincinnati, and that was a question you had, was do guys still look at the Bengals as an opportunity to win now? But the Bengals might be in a position where they're going to be in a bidding war with some of these guys to try to get them to come to Cincinnati?
So the ideal guy at defensive tackle would be like John Franklin Myers. He dominated the Bengals in the Denver game. He's had a great season in Denver. But he's like 29. He was a late breakout guy. Not necessarily, he's not Milton Williams, who signed for $1 billion last year. But because he's I don't think they can get there just because he's the only guy on the market. Now, one of the next Trey Hendrickson types, I believe I've got his name right in his profile, right? Boye Mafe. He's in Seattle. He only had 2 sacks this season. So, of course, that'll give people Shamar Stewart PTSD. But there's a lot to like there. But does the fact that he only has 2 sacks, does that help you get him? Because that lessens what the price will be. So I see more of those options if you're willing to find the right flaws that you can live with at defensive end, but there aren't those types of options at defensive tackle.
Okay, you've given us 2 names. If you can repeat those names and maybe give us 4 or 5 names.
Can I take my phone out?
You can absolutely take your phone out. That Bengals fans should just keep in mind here because, look, the playoffs are still going on. Free agency doesn't start until March. They're going to have a couple of months to think about this. Guys like yourself are going to write about this. If you start thinking about, I would say 4 or 5 names that we're talking about at edge, at defensive tackle that can be difference makers for a team that needs ready-made difference makers, right? Because you're looking at it right now, going into 2026, the only guys on the roster that you can say, okay, those are our edge guys that we can cut loose and feel good about. And maybe there's some people who think Cedric Johnson might be that kind of player going forward. But you're talking about Miles Murphy, who is growing, who is developing, and then Shamar Stewart.
And I don't think Shamar is there yet.
He's not
in
there.
Their mind.
He's not there, and you've pointed that out on this podcast before, and that's the urgency, right, to have to go back and find someone either in free agency or, God forbid, the draft, because they've done that so many times here in recent years. I think they have to do it in free agency. So if you're going to name 4 or 5 names, what are those players?
So the cast of Trey Hendrickson types. Too young, too a bit later in their careers. You've got Odafe Owe, who you saw for the Chargers take over. I think
he was awesome.
I think that was kind of bad for the Bengals, how well he played in that game. You've got Boye Mafe. You've got Draymond Jones, who dominated against the Bengals, and he kind of fits that profile of what they like on the edge. And then Joey Bosa. Boy, that'd be a story. Bengals bring in Bosa. And then 2 maybe sleepers, depth, maybe like next Joseph Osai types would be Clavon Chason and Malcolm Kuntz at defensive end. But then you look at the defensive tackle class. I mentioned Franklin Myers. After that, there is nobody who I point to this guy and I say, I like him. The guy I like the most is 40-year-old Calais Campbell. You've got like guys who are just like role players who are like poor men's BJ Hills. Daquan Jones, LJ Collier is kind of my favorite of the bunch, but as a rotational Chris Jenkins-y type. Other than that, it's a really weak class at defensive tackle.
Okay, so we've talked about defensive line. You mentioned there is a dearth of veteran linebackers who could walk in here and start day one. In your mind, are the Bengals looking for that? Look, they made the decision to go ahead and let Barrett Carter and Demetrius Knight play more than half the season as the 2 starting linebackers in their rookie years. They've had a nice long look at those 2 players. You said yes, the Bengals are looking for a guy. to step in and be day one starter next year?
Now, it's what I'm not expecting, and this isn't reporting, but just knowing the Bengals and how they've had, I'm not expecting them to jump to the very top of the market and go all in on Quay Walker out of Green Bay, who will be one of the more sought-after defensive playmaking free agents in this class. But when you look at veterans who can stabilize the room, but also aren't making so much to the point where, if, and this is a 20% chance, but if Bear and Demetrius both pop, they can still become the guys. I also like the fact that there are some guys I'm about to name who have very specific connections to the Bengals coaching staff. And that's something they really value. So you look at Alex Singleton, you look at who's coming out of Denver, you look at Caden Ellis coming out of Atlanta, drafted by Mike Hodges in New Orleans. You look at Alex Anzalone coming out of Detroit, drafted by Mike Hodges in New Orleans. You've got Leo Chenal, who's been an impact player with the Chiefs. You've got some really old guys in a Bobby Wagner and a DeMario Davis, a Levante David. Maybe it's a Christian Roseboom, who's been a solid role player for the Rams and for the Panthers and is a good kind of glue at the linebacker position. And honestly, there are 4 or 5 more names I could have mentioned at that spot.
That's a lot of names for you to keep in mind, so go hit the rewind button on your podcast and write down those names to follow here the next couple of months. I don't want to dive into draft talk. I want to ask one specific question about a position, because people are going to talk about Caleb Downs as possibly being someone the Bengals could draft at number 10 overall. The Bengals have never used a top 10 draft pick on a safety. I don't think anybody in the NFL has used a top 10 draft pick on a safety in something like 7 or 8 years. Would this be something the Bengals consider at that spot? And consider might be the wrong word, because certainly they'll consider it. Is it something the Bengals should really think hard about and really think they can pull the trigger on a non-premium position, but for a really special player at the number 10 pick?
The answer would have been no a year ago, but the league's changed significantly. So let me ask you a question. Do you think in a role as a part of what he does on his plate, you watch a lot of Ohio State, I don't. I'll get to Caleb before April. Do you think he could do some of the Mike Hilton stuff out of the slot? Do you think he could stick his nose in against the run
100%.
And defeat tight? That's
what he's best at.
Then heck yes.
Yes.
The league has changed in the last year, and it's one of the most fascinating stories around the league to me. I was going through it the other day. Look at who are the top 30 in snaps out of the slot in 2025. Like 20 of those guys are safeties. Safeties play the slot now. Remember who Zach Taylor raved the most about out of any player the Bengals faced this year? Kyle Hamilton, a safety who moved to the slot and played like a linebacker. Now, they didn't face him; he was hurt. But Dalton's slot corner, Minka Fitzpatrick. It didn't work as well with Jalen Ramsey. That was the idea with Jalen Ramsey. The Packers have a guy like that's where the league has gone, and in a world where the whole name of the game now is personnel groupings and how to get an advantage based on the human beings you have on. Well, if we've got 2 tight ends and they counter with 2 safeties, that whole chess match, that's football now. And how you win that is with a safety who can also play the slot. The Bengals learned that secondhand last year, and after a lifetime, except for a few games at Dax Hill, of having true old school slot corners, this year they can make the change.
I can't wait for you to watch Caleb Downs' film, because what he isn't is Ed Reed. He is not an extreme playmaker on the ball in the air. I think he had 4 interceptions in his 2 years at Ohio State, 1 on a tip pass, 1 was thrown right at him. But what he's absolutely excels at is exactly what you said about sticking his nose in there in the run game and being that kind of a stopper from the position. He never makes a mistake. He's a chess piece you can move from all kinds of different positions on the defensive side of the ball. He's just not an elite playmaker with the ball in the air. That's the one thing I haven't seen him do from watching every snap he played at Ohio State for the last 2 seasons. I can't wait for you to watch his film.
And so this is the difference between Lou Anarumo and Al Golden. Lou, and unbelievable job in Cincinnati by Lou Anarumo, but schematically, Jesse Bates and then Geno Stone lined up more at free safety than anybody in the NFL. They were center field, free safeties, end of discussion. Mike Hilton played the slot, end of discussion. Von Bell was your move around box safety. Everybody had their very hyper-specific roles. What did we see specifically after the Thanksgiving game this year, once Al Golden started trusting his guys to do more? You saw Geno Stone moving. You saw Geno Stone blitzing. You saw the safeties making plays on blitzes. You saw a 2-sack game from Demetrius. You saw all of that work together more. And even though Jalen Davis was your slot, he wasn't always playing third down. And their third down packages let him do some more of that. So that Clay, they need a little more splashy, versatile personnel to really get there. But that's Caleb Downs.
Let's transition now to the Reds. We just left a Reds Fest preview in which we spoke with Andrew Abbott and Emilio Pagan before the whole team comes into town for the weekend and has a nice big celebration to kick off the year with the fans. You spoke with both Andrew and Emilio. What was your biggest takeaway from your conversation with the Reds closer and the Reds all-star starting pitcher?
Everyone wants, not them, everyone around town wants the Reds to get a bat. I think the Reds should get a bat. Boy, Emilio and Andrew, both individually in their own roles, appreciate what the Reds did in going out and spending money to get 2 veteran middle relievers, in Caleb Ferguson and in Pierce Johnson, who they officially signed today. That makes their lives so much easier. Emilio Pagan was the story of his season. He became this very nice closer.
Yeah.
But boy, he pitched a lot. Boy, Tony Santian pitched a lot. If they have depth now at that spot in middle relief, like their 7th inning guy last year, and I like him, but it was Graham Ashcraft's first full year as a reliever. Like it could have been Connor Phillips in his first full year as a reliever, serving as that depth behind the 2 guys at the top. To now have guys who have significant experience in setup roles, one, on nights, and Andrew said this, on nights where Andrew doesn't have it, it lets Tito bring in a guy who can get the job done. And then for Pagan, he's not going to have to pitch 100 times this season. So that really helps them, and it gives you some of a window into why Nick Krall said this is our biggest priority, middle relief.
Okay, I asked you to name some names when we talked about the Bengals and free agency. Here we are about 4 weeks from the Reds starting their first full team workout at spring training. So there's a month left here. Are there any names, and if there are, that are still available on the market that would fit the Reds mold? You can get your phone out and try to find those names.
Usually I'm better about having these memorized.
You're talking about bats, okay? Yeah. And there are still a couple of really big name bats out there that I don't think the Reds are going to go for. Kyle Tucker, Cody Bellinger. Those are guys the Reds likely aren't going to go for. But who are some of the guys who are still available that Reds fans can put in the back of their mind here the next 4 weeks to think about that if the Reds are going to add a bat that you argue they still need, who would those names be?
I'll start here. I do very specific salary cap stuff.
Sure.
With the Reds.
As you should.
From what I have, and that's not perfect because there are different things with the structure of the buyout. It's very complicated, the contract structure in baseball. From what I have, they're just over where they were last year, and their plan is to be around the same as where they were last year. I have them at $117 million. I had them at $116 million last year. But we have seen them do some very specific stuff, in some ways more creative than what they've done in the past, to try to maximize every penny they can scratch out this offseason. We see it with how they've done arbitration. We see that with how they pushed a bit of Pierce Johnson's money into 2027. So I wonder if they've done this to try to be able to fit in one more bat, and that's what they're accounting. I think the best case scenario would be bringing back Austin Hayes. Not a perfect player, has had his injuries, but you know what? He led the Reds in slugging and he hit cleanup last year. That to me, but if it's not him, some other names on my list are Paul Goldschmidt, Nate Lowe, Miguel Andujar, Rhys Hoskins, Starling Marte, Donovan Solano. So mostly Austin Hayes types, different flaws, different strengths. Ideally not your cleanup hitter, but maybe because it's the Reds they are. But there are still a few starting level players out there.
What would the price tag be for the average guy on that list?
I think somewhere between some of the guys you could probably get for 2 or 3. Probably for Hayes, I'm probably around $7 million, which is exactly what they just paid Pierce Johnson. Is what I would project Hayes' free agent value to be.
Okay, let's go now to the Gold Rush, and we're going to stay with the Reds here. I have some rapid-fire questions as we look forward to spring training here in a month. As you go out there putting on your Charlie Goldsmith, Charlie Chalkboards, I'm a writer cap, what's the best story going into Reds spring training that you think? Because, look, when the TV guys show up, we're talking to Ellie, we're talking to Spencer, we're talking to Hunter Green. You have the entire canvas of a roster to play with.
Oh, so you mean like
what's the best story?
What's
the best story on the Reds?
Question. I think low-key Connor Phillips. who could be the Reds' 8th inning guy by the end of the season because he was that dominant in September. He was dominant in September. Connor Phillips literally couldn't throw a strike in 2024. So bad that a guy who had already pitched in the big leagues was sent all the way to rookie ball. Rookie ball. And they gave him a break. He was really struggling. And he was physically, he had some thoracic outlet syndrome ramification. That's very serious.
Very serious.
To come back to the point where he could be a 7th or 8th inning guy by the beginning of next season, that to me is fascinating. Noelvi Marte is probably the most interesting guy on the team to me right now. When you look at, you've seen it, the gap between his ceiling and his floor, and because he certainly didn't have this in 24, and last year he was heading to AAA, what his first normal spring training as a big leaguer looks like and how he uses that to polish a game that needs some polishing still, those are 2 ones off the top of my head.
We talk about the bat that the Reds need. The Reds are going to argue that Noelvi Marte is the bat. If you project he played 90 games last year, over a 162. It's 25 home runs, it's 95 RBI, it's high 50s in extra base hits. That's the kind of guy they're going to be looking for if it's an Austin Hayes or an Andujar, that kind of player. That's the kind of production they're trying to find that people would argue, and it might just already be on your roster in the outfield in Noelvi Marte. Okay, next question in the rapid fire. Which Cincinnati Red is under the most pressure in 2026, starting with spring training, to perform at either a higher level than he did last year or a level that can help this team get back to the playoffs?
It's a guy I think should have played more last season. Will Benson he got unlucky last year statistically.
He did.
He was one of the most unlucky players in all. He was crushing the ball. And he won the Reds some games at some very important stretches of the season. I view him as a player who's going into camp competing for a job, and boy, that would be tough if you're Will Benson to have to go back to AAA if you don't win that job. He's a guy who could, we've seen it, he could be this team's left fielder in 2026 and just win that job. Or, because we've also seen this coaching staff pick surprisingly guys over Will Benson for starts, for spots on the roster, because we saw that last year. He's a guy who clearly has an uphill battle because of specific areas he just has to take a huge step with. So he, to me, is a guy who's under a lot of pressure.
The Reds starting rotation is obviously always talked about because they have so many starters and so much depth from, you think back to what you've said in recent times, that they ran out of pitching in recent years, and now they have these 5 or 6 starters that they've kind of built this team around. What do you think could be the surprise story of Red spring training? And I say that because could it be a guy like Rhett Lauder winning a position in the Reds opening day rotation? But taking that out, it could be that. What would you say is the potential to be the surprise of Red spring training camp?
I'll give you 2. One I already talked about, so I'll skip over it. There's a chance that one of Connor Phillips, Zach Maxwell, Luis May show up, and they're just one of the best relievers on the team. Like Fernando Cruz did this in 2023, and here you go. Like, that would be a big surprise. But that's in play. I'll give you 2 more. The first would be, I'll just give you 1 more. Talk about most interesting guys in camp. I don't even know how much you know about this guy, Hector Rodriguez.
Yeah, I know him because you talk about him.
What if Hector has the best chance to pull a Jonathan India, probably since Jonathan India? Now, Jonathan India would be, if we remember, in 2021, came to camp, no big league camp experience, kind of like a guy in the background. Then all of a sudden, they're shaking everything because this guy's one of our guys. I don't think Hector's going to break camp with the team. I'm planning on writing a big feature about Hector this week. Like, Hector is very much on my radar right now, and I want to learn more about him and where he's at and where he stands. But if you're looking for a surprise, Hector starting on opening day, probably not. But maybe. But there's definitely a possibility that Hector is one of the 9 regulars on this team over the whole of the 162 games.
I like that. Great answers. So, guys, to keep in mind, Connor Phillips, Will Benson, Hector Rodriguez, as we get ready for spring training next month in Goodyear, Arizona. Let's finish out the podcast with the Gold Nugget when we dive into Charlie's notebook for his portion of the show when he gets to steer the ship. Great interview, a great nugget, a great anecdote you're working on or have published. What do you have for us in the Great Nugget or the Gold Nugget this week?
We spoke about my conversations with Abbott, but those are the only interviews I've done this week. But I did do some boots on the ground reporting on behalf of Fox 19. I was out covering the Ursuline Mercy McCully basketball game on Tuesday. We mentioned my brother on the show last week. My brother's the assistant coach at Ursuline. I went to support, and I'll just be honest, Mercy McCully was the favorite. They were out to about a 9-point lead. Some really well-designed sets to get, I believe her name is Sunshine.
Okay.
Sunshine had a night from 3. Specifically then with about 30 seconds left, this was another player on the team, a go-ahead 27-foot 3 straight away off the bank, off the glass.
From straight away.
To take the lead. And then what they did best was their defense coming out of Mercy McCully's set plays. You know, they had their actions that they wanted to run, and Ursuline got the job done, and Ursuline pulled out a big win.
Lewis Goldsmith. The genius.
I mean, part of the staff, you know, team victory. Not trying to give, well, yeah, of course, Lewis, but he would want this to be about the whole team. So, of course, shout out to Lewis, but shout out to the whole team for getting the job done.
And we established last week on the Gold Standard that Charlie does, yes, indeed, in fact, love his brother, Lewis. We love you, Lewis. Congratulations on the big win. When do you head out to spring training?
Super Bowl Sunday.
Super Bowl Sunday. Are you going to be flying during the game?
I'll be flying in the morning, so
Okay.
I'll be plenty of time.
So you'll be locked in to watch. What's your prediction for Super Bowl?
I picked the Seahawks to win it all at the beginning of the year.
Beating?
I'll say, well, preseason I had the Bills. Seahawks beating the Bills.
Seahawks beating the Bills. I think that's a good choice. I think I would probably go with the same, but I think there might be an upset along the way. Maybe even the San Francisco 49ers taking down the Seattle Seahawks. We'll see. Not picking it, just saying it here on the Gold Standard. He's Charlie Goldsmith. I'm Joe Danneman. We do this every week, the Gold Standard, talking Reds and Bengals right here on Fox 19 Now.